Hello! We're talking about Navia. She is coming. Who is ready, Swifties? We're doing this again. I wrote a Word doc, which will be attached in the description below if you want to look at that. And I'll be presenting it and talking about a lot of the justifications as a Navia guide. Navia is an attack scaling Geo DPS. She can be played with continuous field time or flexibly, very similar to a lot of recent characters. Being an attack scaling Geo DPS, this is not something we've seen since 1.0 with Ningguang. So first, let's address some commonly asked questions. What is she? She's a main DPS. She can be played more flexibly along the lines of characters we've been seeing more recently, like Nivilet, Linne, or Alhaitham. How much damage does she do? So Navia's mechanics are really unnecessarily complicated. So whenever you trigger a Crystallize, or whenever her burst does damage every 2 seconds, she gets a stack of crystal shrapnel. Her crystal shrapnel stacks can go from 0 to 6. When she uses her elemental skill, her crystal shrapnel stacks are converted into Rosula shard shots, depending on the amount, up until 3. After 3, you get additional elemental skill damage percent from having crystal shrapnel. Reminder, crystal shrapnel is generated from crystallized shards and from Navia's burst. Why are Rosula's shard shots important? Because Navia's talent damage is one value that gets scaled up depending on the amount of Rosula shard shots that hit. They are not transparent about this value. This table is from data mined information. So basically, a single Rosula shard shot, it's 100% of the base talent, 2, 105, 3, 110, 4, 15, 5, 20, 6, 136, 7, 140, 8, 160, 9, 166, 10, 190, and 11 is the full double the amount of the base talent. Don't ask me why this information isn't more available, but here it is. So if Navia's talent has a value of 700, when you hit all 11 Rosula shard shots, it's 200. How do you hit Rosula shard shots? Her elemental skill fires out in a cone in front of her. The closer enemies are, the more likely they are to get hit by more Rosula shard shots. It's a shotgun, basically. That's why it's called the Gunbrella. Now, something I do need to clarify about Crystallize. Crystallize is a little bit of a different elemental reaction. Crystallize has a 1 second global ICD across your entire team per enemy. So each enemy can only be crystallized once per second, which is a bit of a little snag and can affect your GeoApp and your crystal shrapnel gain. Yeah, let's say you're applying Geo twice in 1 second with a multi-hit. It wouldn't necessarily give you an extra crystallize. That is the only reason to mention that. Navia. Let's also talk about gearing weapons. Navia's 5-star weapon is a big-ass axe. It's called Verdict. It gives crit rate, attack, elemental skill damage, and it's a high base. Since it's a very high base weapon that gives attack percent, this weapon's best uses, where it will stand out above the competition, are of course in teams where you have a bunch of attack percent buffs, but not necessarily a bunch of flat attack buffs from someone like Bennett. Since it also is high base and it gives crit and attack, when you're using Farina, it doesn't get drowned out because the only stat Farina gives is damage percent. You need a lot more of every other stat. Which brings us to Serpent Spine, which is a crit rate weapon that just gives you damage percent. There are some conditions we gotta talk about. Wait 20 seconds at the start of a chamber with Navia on slot 1. Never take damage. Always play Bennett. Congrats! Serpent Spine R5 is better than R1 Verdict for Navia, regarding her total damage output, not regarding the hit from her elemental skill. Ways to avoid taking damage are shields. Crystallized shields can help with this, but you do take damage when a crystallized shield breaks, which is why I wanted to call out Zhongli. Interesting mechanic regarding shields and Genshin Impact. No matter how many shields you have equipped, they all take damage simultaneously and that damage is not spread. So if you have a crystallized shield and a Zhongli shield, the crystallized shield and the Zhongli shield, or the crystallized shield will break while your Zhongli shield is still absorbing damage. But that will be important later when we talk about artifacts. Hint, hint. There's also the event weapon. Navia has a really strong free-to-play event weapon coming, provided you get value from the ER. The Ultimate Overlord's Mega Magic Sword is going to give you 48 attack percent, 30 ER, and have 565 base. This weapon is very good and can be better than Tidal Shadow if you do get value from the ER. Also, this weapon gives half the buff if you haven't helped a bunch of Millizines in the Merisi village. So get on it! There is another Battle Pass weapon that released very recently. That's the Talking Stick. It gives less crit rate than Serpent Spine. It gives less damage percent than Serpent Spine, but it also gives you attack percent when you're playing with Bennett, and it can give you the attack percent and the damage percent buffs when you are fighting enemies, basically. The good news regarding this weapon is all of the Fontaine enemies that I'm aware of apply element to you. Very few of them just do fizz damage. So Talking Stick might be a bit more consistent than imagined. We'll see. There's the Woogs. It just gives you a lot of attack. The passive is the least reliable thing in the world, so probably discount that, but it still gives you a lot of attack. There's Unforged, which is another Wolf's Gravestone that gives you attack after you've already done Navia's damage. There's a bit of a conflict with how this works, but Navia's Burst at least can help stack it, so that's nice. The other major free-to-play option is Tidal Shadow. This is another just crap load of attack weapon. It requires you to be healed. You will most likely be healed when you're playing with Farina, because you kind of have to be healed. When you're not playing with Farina, you may find it a bit more difficult to take damage or trigger the passive. Now, artifacts. Navia's releasing with it 2 new artifact sets. One of them is for her. Nighttime Whispers in the Echoing Woods, the essay sentence artifact. This gives you 18 attack percent and 50% geo damage percent. Now, the geo damage percent buff is conditional. You get a lot less geo damage percent if you don't have a Crystalize shield on, which can dramatically affect the performance of this artifact set, even if you have a shield, because as I was talking about, the Crystalize shields break anyway. Very thankfully, Navia has a way to suck up Crystalize shields just by slightly holding her elemental skill, and she also does most of her damage with that elemental skill hit, and her geo-infused normal attacks take place after her elemental skill hits, so your damage is somewhat secure with this set, but the variance specifically for her normal attack damage needs to be mentioned, much like how the variance for her elemental skill damage had to be mentioned. It depends. There is the standard 4.0 artifact sets, Merciless Hunter and Golden Troop. Golden Troop gives you elemental skill damage and more elemental skill damage for the first 2 seconds of field time. This gives you your highest Gunbrella shots if you just want to see big numbers. It will take away damage from your normal attacks and your burst, and is generally worse than Nighttime Whispers in an Echoing Woods, even assuming full uptime on the passive for all of her damage, which might not necessarily be the case. But it does need to be mentioned, specifically because of how resin efficient the domain is, and you won't be able to farm Nighttime Whispers in the Echoing Woods day 1. Well, you will be able to, you just won't have good artifacts. There's 4-piece Merciless Hunter. This is the I'm playing with Farina artifact set. It is the best in slot when you're playing with Farina, and just Farina. Now, the 2-piece artifact options for Navia are similarly pretty simple. You can use any of the attack percent sets, you can use this Geo set, or you could use 2-piece elemental skill. Most people will likely be doing 2-piece skill, 2-piece attack, or 2-piece attack, 2-piece attack, unless you are a very dedicated Petra farmer. Main stats, attack sands, Geo Goblet, Crit Circlet, pretty simple. You can use an attack goblet, specifically if you're doing something like Serpent Spine with Farina. Consult Mr. Optimizer if you want to use an attack goblet. It's a bit difficult to clear the conditions for it to be great. Speaking of sands, no ER sands? No ER sands! Attack scaling. Navia's elemental skill does generate 3 or 4 particles on a 50% probability with it on a 9-second cooldown. Navia will generally be doing 2 or 3 elemental skills per burst. If you do 3, you need very little ER, basically none. If you try to use her elemental burst every 2 skills, you're going to need upwards of a 130 to 150 ER. I recommend building for 3 elemental skills per burst, which kind of goes into teammates, which I'm actually going to jump down to. Navia's teams look a bit hollow currently. She can be slotted without much fuss into existing team cores, whether that be Xingta Yelan or Yelan Farina, or Xiangling Bennett, but she definitely does appreciate having a second Geo character. Her current partners for this are not exactly perfect for her. Navia, being an attack scaling Geo character along the same vein as Ningguang, definitely wants to look at teams people currently do play with Ningguang, just upgrading. So like Xiangling, Bennett, Zhongli, Navia will definitely be very good. Fischl, Bennett, Zhongli, very similarly. If you did want to use Farina, there is not a great healer option. You could definitely do Farina, Bennett. It's just you will struggle with Bennett energy, and it's just not necessarily the most synergistic team, but Navia herself does do enough damage to brute force these teams into being fairly good. So even if she never does get a better partner for Geo, that's a very viable option. Speaking of Farina, there's also Farina Noelle. You can play Farina Noelle with Navia and just kind of swap into Navia and use her elemental skill and maybe an N1. Regarding ways she does damage, you can do elemental skill N4, N1. This is the maximum duration combo that fits inside of her window. The much easier alternative for this is N3D, N2. That's utilizing her full window. If you want to do some partial utilization, there's a pre-funnel combo that can save rotation time and get the cooldown ticking sooner on her elemental skill. Since her elemental skill starts with 2 charges, getting that timer ticking down can make it easier to do, let's say, 3 at once. So there's elemental skill, burst N2, which fits. And then there is the more flexible quick swap E, where you don't really do the auto attacks, where you just E, swap off, do 1 normal attack. Putting a lot of these together, we can do continuous field time combos. So like burst, elemental skill, N3, N2, elemental skill, N3. That should be most of a Bennett window in teams. So let's talk about Constellations before we wrap up. Navia C1 gives her a bunch of energy and reduces her burst cooldown. Her burst is a 60 cost, 15-second cooldown. You can drop it to a 12-second cooldown, and she gets 9 energy back. This depends on her amounts of crystal shrapnel consumed, but you always want to be consuming at least 3 crystal shrapnel, so it shouldn't matter. Similarly, her C2 gives her elemental skill additional crit rate, and whenever her elemental skill hits an opponent, a shot from her burst fires. This is important because her burst gives her crystal shrapnel every 2 seconds, so every couple hits. Her burst does normally 17 hits in total, but her C2 can give you this effect from her burst without using the burst. It's also important when we talk about C4. Navia's C4 is whenever her burst hits an opponent, they are shredded 20% Geo-res. Her C3 is elemental skill damage plus elemental skill damage Giga Chad. As usual, 5 stars, it's about 6% per talent level for that individual skill, making this, let's say, 10% overall. C5 is for her burst, which is a bit whatever. And her C6 gives her a bunch of crit damage, and it makes her crystal shrapnel no longer consumed when you use her elemental skill. So you could do like a bam bam with C6. It's pretty cool. TLDR Navia Guide.